Good afternoon, John. Welcome to TwiceTold.
Thank you so much for having me here, Praveen.
The pleasure is all mine. I'd like to start by introducing you to the concept behind TwiceTold. So, TwiceTold is an exchange between an author and a reader where both of us sit across from a table and speak about the book in depth. You from the perspective of writing it, I from the perspective of reading it. Both of us, we came with, to this juncture with some ideas or preconceived notions, if I may. You may have had, I'm sure, different ideas when it came to writing this book. Some versions in your mind, some in your computer, some with your editor's desk, and finally the book is told only when it is printed. The book was now told to me when I read it. Now I read it on the basis of a couple of assumptions that I've may have made correctly or incorrectly based on hearsay, reading, or so many other sources. And that's how my questions came about. And now that we're here discussing this book at length in detail with these questions, I hope that you will definitely help clarify my understanding and perception of this book. But I also hope that there are some questions may which do leave you pondering or perhaps are scope for a second or a second volume of this book if that may be in the process. So that's how
Absolutely.
the idea of twice told. So
That
thanks again
sounds
for
great.
agreeing to do this.
I'm looking forward to it.
So my first question is going to be about what does it mean to be a slave?
It's a question that has preoccupied scholars for decades now and has been answered from a variety of different perspectives, from a variety of different disciplines, focusing on a variety of different parts of the world. Um, what was clear to the actors in the story that I tell that slavery was a very old human status. It was almost as old as human civilization as such. But that across cultures, across parts of the world, slavery shared a couple of key features. One is the absolute subordination of the person who is enslaved, not simply to the state, not simply to an abstract structure or an economic mode of production, but rather to an individual person. So the concept of slavery has always been closely paired to the joined concept of mastery. Second key feature of slavery, which was common across centuries and cultures, or was thought to be so in the early modern period, was that slavery emerged in close proximity with death, with the human condition of life that was closest to death. The most often source of slavery, the circumstance, the event in which people came to be enslaved was as captives in war who could have been killed or as an alternative placed into the power, indeed into the hands of a single person as an alternative to death. So those are a couple of key features. We can talk more, I think, about the connection between slavery and property, probably over the course of our discussion. The question of the centrality of property to the concept of slavery has long been a topic of controversy and debate, and answers have differed from person to person. But that's a start.
Understood. My next question is going to be about the motives behind slavery. You mentioned mastery over a person, and interestingly, as you mentioned, property. So, does that belie profitability as the prime mover or prime motive?
That's a great question. Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations from 1776, in a sense, the founder of modern economics, said that because slavery was so clearly less profitable than free labor, it only persisted due to the pride of man, which makes him love to domineer, Smith said. In other words, masters only preferred enslaved to free labor uh, because it allowed them to exercise, it allowed full scope to their pride and love of domination in a way that free labor, at least according to Smith, did not so much. So even though property, connection between slavery and property, because slaves have always been understood to be, or almost always been understood to be people made to labor on behalf of those who hold them in subordination. Uh, there's always been a close connection between slavery and property, but the kind of uh, whether there might be deeper motives drawn from human nature itself that push people to this ultimate measure of domination and subordination has always been a question on the mind of scholars, such that slavery has always been seen, on the one hand, as an economic institution rooted in ideas of property, in which case the kind of motives of slavery, as you say, are clear, profit of the master. But on the other hand, slavery gives rise, not just to mode of production, it gives rise to natal alienation. It arises in close association with death. It allows full scope to the human impulse to dominate others. Uh, so much so that the psychology of human beings is caught up with the institution of slavery. Many authors have, scholars, people who have been enslaved, um, general observers of the institution of slavery have concluded that the roots of slavery are to be found much deeper in some dark aspects of, of human nature itself. It's slavery is as old as time. Is for centuries and centuries such a widespread institution. It's not exactly an easy answer to say where it came from. If it were, then the abolition movement, in the 18th century and 19th century would have had an easier time with it. One of the difficulties that they had to overcome is that slavery seemed to be so rooted in what it was that made us human.
That's a fantastic way to look at it. Now, when is it that we have the earliest known instance of a human held in bondage as a slave?
Well, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, freedom is the natural condition of humankind. Freedom is thought to be the original condition of humankind in the Garden of Eden. Freedom and equality. This is a common theme in many of the kind of early modern and modern myths that people told about the deep human past. It's also the case, found to be the case in the Roman law, or even in Hesiod's Ages, the Greek myths about the ages and the stages of human history. Freedom and equality was always thought to be the original condition of the species. And like other forms of subordination, slavery was said to come in over time. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, which was such an important formative text for the world that I aim to describe, slavery came in. The first instance of it that's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible is that it came in as a result of a curse that came to be known as the curse of Ham, which took place, pronounced by Noah just after the flood. And the curse was came to be understood in a variety of different ways, but slavery was always understood to be a terrible condition, which no one would feel was a blessing to their life. But it was also a condition that had its roots, very, very, very deep in the past, even if it wasn't the original condition. Just as old as property was, just as old as the family was, as old as cities and states and economic inequality. So slavery was part of that, bound up with that massive process by which human beings departed from the original condition of life. We're talking about actual history. I don't know that there is a known first instance of the origins of slavery. Some of the very, very earliest slave societies were in the Mediterranean Ocean, on islands in the Mediterranean. Slavery always thrived through the early modern period on small remote islands, and then models that were developed on those islands, models of slavery developed on those islands, then spread elsewhere across the world. And I think that was true in the archaic Mediterranean world. But But as I said earlier, you know, so common has slavery been, so deep are its origins in the past, that me as a scholar of the history of slavery, I couldn't tell you. I don't know what the first instance, of slavery was in the world.
Understood. Were there no tablets, perhaps from either where Mesopotamia or perhaps Phoenicia, of humans being traded, perhaps books of account or bills of receipt?
And the answer to your question is yes, yes, of course. In all of the oldest tablets, in all of the oldest, for example, the 12 tablets, which is the kind of earliest statement, earliest evidence that we have of Roman law, slavery appears um, there. Slavery is treated not as something to be explained either, or as a practice that needed to be defended, or as the subject of common debate on which there were two sides, one who believed in slavery and one who did. That's not how the slavery is treated when people who are enslaved are mentioned in some of these oldest uh, law codes and little shards of culture that we have. It's treated as part of as one of the common facts of human life. And in some sense, this is, this is one of the striking facts that ancient history presents to us as modern observers. The passiveness, the extent to which slavery was so much taken for granted, far, far into the past.
Understood. Now, my next question is going to be about views on slavery, especially the differences of views between Aristotelian and Justinian laws when it came to slavery, and how did this translate into rights, especially for people who are enslaved?
Mm. And you're right to point to this division, the contrast between two very important models for thinking about slavery. These are important models for thinking about slavery in the classical Mediterranean world, Justinian's laws on slavery, the laws on slavery that were compiled under direction of the Emperor Justinian, come from the Roman Empire, and then of course Aristotle's Politics is a classic product of ancient Athens, and but they held very different views on what slavery was. Aristotle says, the famous doctrine of Aristotle is the doctrine of natural slavery. Says that in any composite made up of parts, those parts will be arranged into a hierarchical order. And it is fit that this order is maintained so that humans rule the animals among the forms of animate life. The soul rules the body within the figure of an individual human being. And those who are destined to be masters fitly rule, or by nature rule, those whom nature has designated to be slaves. Aristotle refers to a slave as someone who can be and therefore is another's man. In other words, because nature has made some persons slaves, for that reason, they are fit to be slaves. It doesn't matter about the circumstances of their lives. They are slaves everywhere, even when not enslaved, in fact. And Aristotle posed this conception of natural slavery, which is a very unusual conception, by the way, in the history of Western thought, and we can discuss that later. But he posed this conception of slavery in opposition to a different theory of slavery that was then, developed and taken up in Justinian's law code. And that theory of slavery is, in Aristotle's terms, conventional, not natural, conventional. And here, all people are thought to be free by nature, by the law of nature in Justinian's law. Slavery is a matter of convention, most often arises for people who are taken captive in war. In order to state why someone is a slave, you don't have to make any special statement or give any special description about their particular natures. Slavery doesn't have to do with the natures of people. It has to do with what happens to them, the accidents and misfortunes that befall them, and bring them into a condition most proximate to death. And in that condition, slavery is conceived as the most minimal possible form of human mercy. Um, and all sorts of things follow from this distinction, but those are the two, those were thought to be the two central models thinking about slavery coming from the classical Mediterranean world, which were still available, widely available and well known in early modern European culture.
Understood. Now, how is it that Rome did not adopt the Aristotelian view on slavery, especially when Rome needed a large body of young men throughout for its imperial ambitions?
So, on the one hand, as you rightly point out, the Aristotelian theory of slavery seems well suited to the imperial ambitions of a powerful state. Aristotle himself said that if they were all joined together, the Hellenes, the Greeks like himself, would rule the world. And that seemed to many observers to anticipate the world-spanning conquests of Alexander the Great, who seems to have studied with Aristotle as a tutor. Um, and yet, if you really, study even the intellectual history of the classical world, the theory of natural slavery is extremely unusual. And almost no contemporary of Aristotle, very few later, many, many, well, it's a complicated field, but very few of his, of the people who followed him accepted this doctrine of natural slavery. It is an unusual, uncommon, according to many later scholars, totally incoherent theory of slavery and of the world. And in part, this is because the Aristotelian theory of slavery means that the kind of common customs of slavery, so common in human war, in which slavery is, rises as status, for people taken captives in war, that this brand of conventional slavery is unjust on the Aristotelian model, unless the people who are made war upon are themselves naturally slaves. The requirements for people to be naturally slaves on Aristotle's model, too, are quite exact and stringent. Natural slaves can have no deliberative faculty at all, Aristotle says. They cannot reason for themselves. They can only apprehend the reason of a master. And so, in the 16th century, there's this famous debate in the court, the Spanish court, about the justice of the conquest of the Indies. And there was a debate on the one hand between a defender of the justice of the conquest named Sepulveda and his critic named Las Casas, who placed himself or billed himself as the apostle of the Indians and the savior of the Indians. And Sepulveda said, drawing on Aristotle, that the Native Americans are by nature slaves. They fit Aristotle's definition. And Las Casas, who had spent a great deal of time in the Americas and had done a lot of historical and geographical work on the peoples of the Americas, just described their common customs and said people who have ordered themselves into states with practices of commerce and judicial customs cannot be considered natural slaves at all on Aristotle's definition. And so the requirements of natural slavery are very stringent. And any society that lives by the normal customs of human life as they were well understood to Aristotle would not meet the definition of natural slavery. And the same would have been the case in the Roman Empire. What the Romans always said was that they were, conquering large civilizations, which required armies and on which they aimed to impose their laws, and which they would extract tribute from, which would become a part of the empire. And so the definition of natural slavery would almost preclude the inclusion of conquered peoples in the broader imperial realm. The Romans were absolutely happy to enslave their captives in war, but they also never seemed to require a theory of their natural inferiority in order to justify that practice. They did, just fine without it. justifying their conquest on the basis of, and their enslavement of peoples whom they conquered on the basis of the conventional theory of slavery. They didn't seem to need anything more.
Understood. So, is it safe to presume that the Romans operated under the code of Lex Stalinus?
In which what is taken in war becomes the property of the captive. Yeah, absolutely.
Precisely,
That
yes.
yeah, that is. In other words, that slavery was part of the law of war. Yeah.
Understood. Now, Aristotle's definition of a slave somehow seems to fit exactly what we later would call a computer. That it has does not have a mind of its own. It can only comprehend the instructions of its master. Now, returning to Aristotle, do we know something about his personal life that may have influenced him and his biases in this manner, such that he came up with these laws?
I just finished teaching, probably for the 10th time or so, Aristotle's Politics. And every time I do, I focus on book one, which is where the most substantial discussion of slavery takes place. And there are some single facts about Aristotle. One is that that book is important, one of the most important books ever written in the West, in the Western philosophical tradition, of course. Um, but it speaks to and about a very particular situation, which is the classical Greek city state. And Foucault, Michel Foucault, great 20th century scholar, French scholar, said that the politics is like the great nostalgic statement of the classical Greek city state, which was, with which Aristotle so entranced. But Aristotle himself was not a member, he was not a citizen of Athens. He was a resident alien because he was from elsewhere, he was from Macedon. And he clearly says that resident aliens play no part of the state. The state is defined by its citizens, and Aristotle was not a citizen of the Athenian state. There's also some speculation that Aristotle's wife was herself formerly a slave. And Aristotle lived in a world in which slavery was a common practice. It's well described in, for example, the Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, but it was practiced on the conventional model. At the same time, Aristotle was writing 5th century Athens, and some Greek historians have really showed this really well. And I've relied, for example, on some really nice kind of descriptions of ancient slavery by Peter Hunt in recent years. But Aristotle was writing at a time where it was a common trope in Athens that the Athenians were destined to rule, and that barbarians, the people outside their borders whose language they did not share, were destined for subordination. It was a time of great kind of xenophobic, prideful conquest on the part of the Athenians. And so Aristotle slotted his theory of natural slavery into that common prejudice of the time. And so there's some biographical facts that make the theory puzzling, but then there are some, historical facts from the time that that explain the theory of natural slavery as an outcome of a very specific moment in ancient Athenian culture.
Understood. Understood. Now, moving on to Britain, before Britain's conquest by Romans, do we know if the Britons had notions of slavery or holding people in bondage?
This is another field which has always been thought to be um, difficult to access and not perfectly understood. At the same time, in their own conquest of the Britons, the Romans had enslaved many the ancient Britons and traded them down and brought them within the realm of the empire and back to Rome. So, uh, and some of the works from the time, for some of the historians from the time, for example, Tacitus, write about the Roman conquest of Britain. And what they say is not really that the Britons practiced slavery in their own society, due to the fact that the Britons, like the Gauls, like the Germans, were seen by the Romans as being a primitive people, primitive and egalitarian people, a people who, like I mentioned earlier, were kind of at an earlier point in the development of human civilization than the Romans themselves understood to be. And since slavery was thought to be a product of human civilization, product of the ambivalent progress of the species over time, peoples who were thought to be more primitive, to be at an earlier point of development, were often thought not to practice slavery among themselves. And what the Roman historians of Britain and of the Roman conquest of Britain say pretty often is that the Britons resisted their conquest vociferously. They fought for their freedom. They fought for their freedom, and they failed. They were, themselves enslaved. Many of them were, but they had a peculiar commitment to freedom. And so when early modern English historians took up the question of the distant English past, in which they had, some interest, the theme that they come back to again and again is not whether there were practices of slavery in the British Isles, but the resistance that the Britons had always put up against invasion from abroad. The Romans on the one hand, in the 11th century, the Normans in the course of the Norman conquest. The Britons themselves had always been peculiarly devoted to freedom. At the same time, from the Doomsday Book, there was, it was always recorded that there were people who were considered to be slaves in England, and that slavery gradually died out over time in a process we can discuss. There's no question there was slavery in Britain, but the dominant cultural self-understanding of Britain was as a country devoted to fighting for their freedom.
Understood. Now, remaining in Britain and speaking about the concept of villainage, could you walk us through what was villainage? How did it begin? How did it grow? And why do we see it suddenly start to taper out toward the end of the 16th century, especially in Britain? So, do you believe one of the reasons for its downfall was perhaps a lasting effect of the Black Death?
In short, yeah, that's correct. Now, just like the end of ancient slavery, or kind of the decline of slavery in the Roman Empire and former Roman Empire, is a process that scholars have really struggled to describe in detail. It's just one of those gradual historical processes that for which the sources are not what you would want them to be. And it's a process of decline, decline of slavery in the former Roman Empire and in the Roman Empire, rather than abolition, right? That's the story of the end of slavery in the former Roman Empire. It's not the story of abolition; it's the story of the decline of slavery. The same is the case for villainage in England as well. Now, Villains, Villeins, Villains were more are better understood as being part of a proximate condition to medieval serf, in the sense that Villains were legally tied to the land on which they worked, which was owned by by feudal lords. And for that reason, they were not owned by their lords or masters. They worked on land that was owned by their masters and were tied to that land as a result. They also had more, this, all the kind of important English authorities say this. The Villains had more rights than slaves did, or even than slaves in the ancient Roman Empire were understood to have as well. They could sue their masters in certain cases and possessed a degree of autonomy that Roman slaves were not thought to. But over time, over the middle, over the 15th and 16th centuries in particular, villainage died out. And as populations in the British Isles were drawn toward city centers and centers of population, and the lanes were kicked off their lands as well. Villainage slowly declined. There was a greater demand for labor after the Black Death. And the decline and end of villainage, which seemed to have been more or less complete, it's a matter of perception rather than reality, it's true, but seemed to have been more or less complete by the middle of the 16th century, seemed to Britons to signal that there were no people in the present whose status recalled that of the slaves in ancient Rome and the Roman Empire. In other words, that the promise or the impulse, the desire of the Britons to be free, so reflected in their resistance to foreign invaders, was now realized in reality, was now real, because there were no people whose status recalled that of slaves in ancient Rome. And what signaled that was not so much the dying out of slavery in England. Slavery seems to have died out in England long before the end of villainage. It was the dying out of this more paradigmatically medieval condition as well.
Understood. Now, moving on to Martin Luther and his views on slavery. What were his views, and did these views eventually influence Alberico Gentili when he wrote against slavery?
Mm. Now, there are always different dimensions of thoughts about slavery. And this is one thing that makes scholarship on slavery so difficult or so complicated. Because slavery is not or has not in human history just been a term applied to the status that we've been discussing, in which a person is under the absolute dominion of another, often treated as their property. They're reduced to that condition in close proximity to or as an alternative to death. Like we have been talking about slavery as the condition of real human beings in relation to real human beings. But so resonant and important and powerful has that condition been thought to be over time. So much has it affected people's views of what it means to be human, that slavery has also been used as a metaphor, not to describe real human life, but in order to describe the soul, for example, or living in a state of sin. And freedom, by contrast, or freedom at the same time, has been understood not just as a condition of real human beings with respect to real other human beings, but as a condition of the soul as well. And so what was most prominent in Martin Luther, in the Reformation generally, was were ideas about freedom and slavery on that metaphorical level, about slavery as a condition of the soul, and the idea that people who were free in real life in relation to others could be a slave, could also be slaves in relation to sin, their desires. Indeed, the people who were slaves, people subject to the terrible vicissitudes of fortune, could achieve real freedom on the spiritual level through their relation with God. And so, insofar as the Reformation had transformative effects, thinking about slavery, it was more about the relationship between slavery, freedom, and sin, and the relationship between the individual and their God, rather than any direct effect the contemporary practice of slavery. Now, that's it's a very complicated field, but that is my most basic answer to that question. Although I would say, with respect to Gentili, who you also asked about, Gentili is very important early modern author about writing about slavery, and he was unusual in that he was an Italian immigrant to England. He was Italian, but he was a Protestant and immigrated to England and became a very important expositor in England of the civil law, which is the early modern version or descendant of Roman law. So Gentili's views about slavery, I would argue, I have argued in the book, are more indebted to Roman law than they are to Protestant theology. Although he does inherit a deep aversion to what he sees as the rapacious Catholic powers of the early modern Atlantic world.
Interesting. I would not have known that if he had not spoken about it. So I drew a direct line between Gentili and Martin Luther purely on the plank of Protestantism. But the fact that he's Italian and therefore some hints of Roman law would have also imbibed into his education, it completely skipped my mind. Thank you for that.
As always, for me, the answer comes back to Roman law. We can talk more about that.
Interesting. Now, my next question is going to be on another Roman, Grotius and the laws of war and peace. So, I believe his education was Aristotelian. So, how is it that he came to detest slavery?
Well, this is the case for many of the most important early modern theorists of natural rights and early modern um, uh, political theorists generally. So this is the case for Grotius. It's also famously the case some decades later for Hobbes. And in this respect, in my account of Grotius in particular, I'm drawing on the works of uh, a, a great scholar of this field named Richard Tuck. And Tuck has treated Grotius's intellectual trajectory many times over the course of his career. And for the most part, I'm following what Tuck has said and filling in some of the accounts around it. Because Tuck's interest in Grotius more has to do with his pure doctrine of natural rights and his conception of the state, and with his understanding of the natural law. Whereas my focus, is always is on the issue of slavery and freedom. And what Tuck says is that Aristotle still formed a central part of the European curriculum in the early modern period. Hobbes at university read Aristotle, and Grotius was immersed in Aristotle. And Grotius's earlier work, some of his earlier work, at least tries to reconcile his own views of freedom and slavery and political theory in general with the authoritative figure of Aristotle. But over time, and certainly by the time of the 1631 revision, the laws of war and peace, the break with Grotius's break with Aristotle had become clear. And now he was full-throated and direct in his rejection of Aristotle's theory of slavery. And in this, Grotius followed a well-known trend of early modern political theory. In other words, I don't think that it should surprise scholars in the field, and I don't think that it should surprise scholars of the history of slavery as much as it might, to know that ideas about slavery in the early modern period were predominantly not Aristotelian, because the move away from Aristotle, the gradual rejection of Aristotelian political thought, is a dominant theme of early modern political thought in general. The basic premise of early modern political thought, what makes it early modern, is that it starts from the idea that all people are free and equal, not the natural, the ideas of natural subordination and domination that characterize Aristotle's political thought. So Grotius's rejection of Aristotle is part of a well-known trend in that was taking place right around the same time that he was that he was brought up and educated, and of course to which he contributed. He contributed to the general move away from Aristotelian thinking about everything, but including about slavery.
Understood. So, do we see the same thread play out when we look at Grotius, Hobbes, and Pufendorf all advocating against slavery? Is it the same argument that's getting extended?
I would put them in a tradition of thinking about slavery, which is a tradition that is essentially anti-Aristotelian. And their statements on this topic could not be more clear. They say no one is by nature a slave. There are no, or we have found no, at the very least, people who are naturally slaves in the mode of Aristotle. They say, by contrast, all three of those authors, Grotius, Hobbes, and Pufendorf, say by contrast that all people are by nature free. But the natural freedom of all humankind doesn't mean that no people can legitimately be made slaves. Because as in Roman law, for these seminal early modern thinkers, nature doesn't set an ultimate limit on the consequences of human action. There are all sorts of departures from the natural condition. There's no, the state doesn't exist under natural law or in the natural condition either, but it's developed over time. And there are no wars in the natural condition, but war develops over time, along with the process of the formation of states. And slavery is another human status which develops over time, not natural in the Aristotelian sense, but as in Roman law, it develops over time under certain circumstances. Most often for people who are taken captives in war, but also for people, this is important for both Grotius and Pufendorf, for people who consent to be slaves in times of famine or in dire straits in return for what they need, to survive. So as different, as subtle as Grotius, Hobbes and Pufendorf are, all are immensely subtle thinkers. They share, they work within that basic model of ideas about slavery. That's what I argue.
Understood. Now, speaking about people who willingly subject themselves into slavery due to financial duress, so what was the traditional treatment for them? What was the case for slavery or against slavery for such people?
Well, look, this is also a time in the early modern period where people, political theorists are starting to say no one is by nature a slave. All people are by nature free and equal. But they're trying to explain not only the natural freedom and equality of people, but also the real contemporary inequalities between people and the habits and institutions of power and subordination that have developed. And so they want to explain both sides of that. On the one hand, the freedom and equality of people naturally, and on the other hand, the fact that people living today are neither, for the most part, neither free nor equal, or at the least are not equal. And so they use a variety of methods in order to explain the paths or the routes that lead from the natural condition to the contemporary condition of human life. And one, of course, is war. The force that was, ever present in the ancient and the early modern, the modern world. But they also are convinced that the ultimate thing that people want is life. They want to preserve their lives. And you can build up all systems of morals from that basic insight that life is the highest good. In other words, that there is no status worse than death. And so slavery arose in their thought as in the old Roman law, out of the insight that there is no status worse than death. Slavery is the human condition most proximate to death. And it is kind of the most minimally preferable condition to death that a person might find themselves in. And so if people were had no other means to survive, Grotius says, they might legitimately exercise their natural rights in enslaving themselves to a master in return for the necessaries of life that they might need to survive. In other words, they might sell themselves. And that is not on Grotius's view, a desirable condition anyway at all. But it is not death. And in that sense, it is a choice that people might be allowed to make.
Understood. Now, do we know if there were any influences of Ottoman slavery and slaving practices on English notions of slavery?
Yes. And um, the Mediterranean origins of American slavery is a field that um, more and more scholars are working on with each passing day. You'll notice that my book is focused on the Atlantic world, on Europe, Africa, uh, and America. But that was not the only sphere or region or part of the world in which slavery was, thought about and practiced and was very present, even in the minds of the supposedly insular English. And one of the things that was very apparent to English authors, Alberico Gentili, for example, uh, um, was that across the Mediterranean world, English sailors were being taken captive by um, by Muslim corsairs and pirates and states across the Mediterranean world, being held as captives, held as slaves, and that the English would often ransom their captives. And the calls for ransom, to ransom back these Christian servants or slaves, were ever present in early modern English culture. You find them in all sorts of newspapers, and the drives to raise funds were like important kind of early social movements, not against slavery as such, right? Not against slavery as such, but against the enslavement of English, the enslavement of the English. And one of the most kind of galling aspects to the English public of the enslavement of some of their countrymen in the Muslim world was that they were often believed to have been forced to convert uh, um, to Muslim religion in order to obtain their freedom, and that some of their countrymen had taken this bargain. Seemed very distressing. And we can talk later, I think we will, about the connections between slavery and conversion, slavery and religion. But this is one of the areas, the enslavement of English Christians by Muslim corsairs and pirates was one of the early contexts in which the English thought through. It was also well known, because the customs of slavery across the Ottoman Empire and across much of the Muslim world were very similar to the customs of slavery that went back to the Roman law. Slavery was a status for captives taken in war. But what was also well known in England was that across the Muslim world, um, Muslims had come to an agreement never to enslave each other, even when taken captives in war. Muslims would not enslave their co-religionists. And so slavery came to be associated with interreligious war, with differences across religions, which is not to say that any English author said, not to say that it was a common English view at the time that all Muslims were essentially slaves, or that all people outside the bounds of Christendom were slaves, but rather that people outside the Christian sphere were Christians, just like people outside the Muslim sphere or Muslims, were the subjects of enslavement, could be enslaved in a way that their co-religionists could not. They learned from their understanding of slavery in the Muslim world to think of slavery as reserved for religious others, and that learning, proved to be very important in the later English experience.
Understood. Now, focusing especially on the religious aspect, Two things come to my mind. That is the Islamic poll tax or jizya to be extracted from anyone who is not Muslim. And now, as you mentioned, converting your slaves into Islam. Now, why would any self-serving governor or emperor or king or whoever, any authority, try to convert their slaves to Islam? One, you would lose your source of poll tax. Second, you lose the slave. So this is bad for business, isn't it?
Bad for business, perhaps. But you know, when I've been reading really deeply into the um, early modern texts and early modern culture, um, more and more as I, over the course of researching and writing this book, became impressed with, or came to terms with the fact that if taken seriously, the doctrines of Christianity meant something very specific and held a very high status, in the sense that there was no cause more important than the cause of conversion. In other words, for a believing Christian, if also for a believing Muslim, there was nothing more important than salvation by God, than access to God, than coming into direct relationship with God, than the salvation of souls. There was nothing more important than this, than to take that idea seriously. Meant you would have to be convinced of the importance of converting as many people as you could, including people who are in a position of radical subordination within one's own society, not due to any strictly profit-based motives, but rather due to the just as a conclusion of the religious conviction that there was nothing more important than conversion and salvation. The kind of the proselytizing mission must emerge as a direct um, logical outcome of the basic tenets of Christianity, and I think the same is also true, and helps to explain the widespread conversion of slaves in the Muslim powers of the early modern world.
Understood. So there is this element of altruism which seems to exceed and far surpass any profitability or desires of mastery over people. Is that a correct assumption?
I think that's right. I'm not sure that I would call it uh, perhaps perceived altruism. Uh, and of course, altruism is of a kind, since the conversion of people who were enslaved and their subsequent, perhaps, release from the condition of slavery was not often was not often seen to lead to relations of love and beneficence. There are many conditions of horrific conditions of subordination that were not slavery. And many scholars have argued as well, many scholars of religion and slavery over time have argued as well, that conversion and religion were used as mechanisms in order to ensure the subordination and accommodation, and even assimilation of those who were enslaved. Slavery without, slavery on the Roman model is a very bare condition. It's a condition of force. It has its origins in force, it continues due to force. And in places where there are large populations of people who are enslaved, hating their condition and hating their oppressors, there's very little ideological gloss that would, you know, kind of mask the force at the root of that condition. And so the conversion of people who are slaves, and as a result, their release from the condition of slavery as such, has often been seen as a possible way to secure the institution of slavery and the power of the people at the top of the hierarchy, even if they're the people they hold, and from whom they profit are not slaves. Their domination, or the subordination of such people, is rendered even more secure by the mechanism of conversion.
Understood. Now, moving on to France, why is it that we see zero grounds for slavery or tolerance to slavery in this particular country?
Well, France worked on a similar timeline to England in this respect, and this was pointed out by Jean Baudin, whose work on 6 books of the Commonwealth became such an important early modern source for English authors. And Baudin was very proud to report on a case in France where a Genoese merchant had brought person who was considered to be his slave within the borders of the realm, and the courts of I believe that the city was Toulouse, had said that no person is a slave within this realm. All people are frank and free within the borders of within France, just as within England as well around the end of the 16th century. And in part, this came out due to the end of serfdom and villainage over time. A growing conviction about the importance of free labor as opposed to serfdom or villainage. And also the end of serfdom and villainage in France as well as England was part of a broader development, which I haven't mentioned, which is the development of the sovereign central state. There has always been thought to be a tension between slavery and the sovereign central modern state. Because what is slavery? As to go back to the first question we discussed, slavery is the domination of one person by another, the almost absolute domination of one person by another. For every slave, there is a master. And the power of the master is kind of interposed between the power of the slave between the person of the slave and the ultimate state. And the tendency, the desire of centralized sovereign states was to have direct power over every person within their realm, which they didn't have if some persons within their realm were slaves under the power not just of the state, but of their master. And so there's always been, Adam Smith remarked on this, Tocqueville remarked on this, many of the anti-slavery authors of the 19th century American anti-slavery movement remarked on this, that to favor a powerful central state always brought the state into conflict with slavery. Slavery represented a challenge to its power, and indeed, a kind of holdout, a vestige of an older feudal past, in which there were weak states and strong, feudal lords or barons who had, more direct control of the people under their command. In fact, there's been a really nice recent book called American Dark Age by a friend of mine named Kedrick Roy. Came out a couple of years ago. And Kedrick said that the history of ideas about slavery in America always associated slavery with feudalism, like a pre-modern age. And as the state advanced, it kind of pushed back the slavery that represented older feudalism, claiming power over all the citizens within its realm, including over slaves, producing, or contributing to an emancipation movement, but also contributing and solidifying the power of the state. So that was in the background of the end of villainage in England, and also the end of serfdom in France. So free, yes, all the people around were free, but this put them under the direct, control of the sovereign state. It wasn't freedom in the absolute.
Understood. So is it safe to say that the decline of slavery ties hand in hand with the growth and development of English capitalism?
Now, now we're into some very complicated terrain. The relationship between slavery and capitalism is a topic of immense scholarly and public debate. And this has been the case for centuries, even, because the controversies all date back to readings of the works of Adam Smith, readings of the canonical works of Karl Marx, and even in modern scholarship, the field of modern scholarship on slavery, the debates go back to um, uh, W.B. Du Bois's classic 1935 book called Black Reconstruction, and to a very important book by Trinidadian historian and politician named Eric Williams called Capitalism and Slavery from 1934. And um, the question is, the question boils down really to the definition of terms. On the one hand, there is no question that slavery was a powerful economic contributor force to the rise of capitalist economies across the Atlantic world, what became capitalist economies across the Atlantic world. That was the argument that Eric Williams laid out. Marx was, well aware of this. Slavery and the slave economies and the production of goods to which slave economies contributed were powerful contributors to what became capital across the Atlantic world. Slavery and capitalism were tied together in their origins. At the same time, this is why I say, in a sense, it's a debate about the definition of terms, because very few people would deny the point that I just made. On the other hand, on the traditional reading, let's just take the Marxist framework. On traditional reading, slavery is by definition not capitalism, because capitalism starts from what we were just talking about. It starts from the emancipation of workers, from the ambivalent or apparent emancipation of workers. Slaves were part of the means of production. Under capitalism, workers are not part of the means of production. So there's no question that on that traditional definition, slavery is not capitalism. Capitalism is a distinctive mode of production, different from slavery by definition. But that the two, slavery and capitalism, in this critical period for the origins of capitalism, 16th, 17th, 18th century, 19th century world, were intimately tied up with each other. The question of how you want to put that relationship, how you want to define those terms, is the topic of a lot of debate. But that is how I would lay out the terrain of debate.
Understood. It was interesting because, as you said, that with the development of sovereign states, they would not want these little feudal lords challenging the supremacy of the state and thereby emancipating populations en masse. But yes, I can see how capitalism relies on modes of production for its profitability, and slavery being one mode of production feeds into capitalism, which I presume is Eric Williams's argument as well in Capitalism and Slavery.
Yes, or indeed, and there's a question of how strongly you want to put that case. Some would say that the profits from slave labor in the Atlantic colonies made possible the rise of capitalism in England and in Europe. That they were the essential, central contributors to what became capital. And other scholars would say that the profits from slavery were less important than that to the development of capital, the rise of capital. And even other scholars would say that capitalism is present. It's possible to discern industrial capitalist production within the European economies, in particular the English economy in this case, from before the time when the proceeds, profits from the slave colonies really started to transform the British economy. That is a more subtle, I think, more accurate debate, more honest debate, debate to have. But we're all, kind of debating within similar understanding of terms. We're just trying to see, how important the profits from slavery were the development of capitalism in the Industrial Revolution in the European economy.
Understood. My last question would be now, what might be a future for humanity that is free of slavery. As you know, slavery has now evolved from the formal economy and has diversified. I'm sorry to use that word, but it has diversified or changed forms in such ways that it's difficult to categorize what is slavery, what is not. But how do we visualize a truly emancipated humanity in a perhaps a future that we could possibly see?
Mm. And I know many scholars of the history of slavery who, in more recent years, have turned their attention not to the history of slavery, but rather to the present slavery. One of my mentors is a scholar named Orlando Patterson, who is perhaps the greatest living scholar of slavery. Um, I've been earlier in our conversation, I was drawing on some of Patterson's arguments in a classic book called Slavery and Social Death from 1982. Indeed, when we were talking about Protestantism and religion and slavery, I was drawing on some of Patterson's arguments from his next book called Freedom in the Making of Western Culture. And in recent years, Patterson has come to focus on the contemporary condition of slavery and has written a book called Enslavement, Past and Present. And as you say, it would be hard to state a definition of slavery that would exclude the contemporary practice of slavery from it. In fact, the definition that I provided right at the start would absolutely include or encompass within it the status of people who are, in some estimates, the number is 20 to 40 million people who would be encompassed under that definition of slavery living today. At the same time, as you also say, slavery now is not what it was in the 19th century. And the abolition movement was a massive historical achievement, and it didn't have to happen. It didn't have to succeed, right? Slavery was a long standing tradition across societies, across centuries. The abolition argument, the abolition movement did bring to an end something, which is to say, it brought a formal end to the status of slavery. Slavery is not legal now, not described and authorized in broad law codes. There are no slave societies, which is to say, large-scale societies founded upon slavery as a social status, political condition, and mode of production in the way that there were in the 19th century. There is no pro-slavery argument today. Slavery happens in the absence of arguments that would legitimate it. We all seem to agree. One of the very few things we do seem to agree on in our politics, that slavery is wrong. And yet, in a vast, variegated global economy in which the sovereignty of states, right, can be skirted in international transactions, slavery persists, into the present. I think what I would say about, in answer to your question of how we can envision a future of liberation and freedom for humanity, first thing I think we have to do is, or we can do, in support of our aims, to look back into the past and to see what are the examples that we have before us of some of the most truly successful, perhaps the most successful social movement in all of human history, which is just emerging around my time, kind of on the kind of margins of the time I describe in my book, which is the anti-slavery movement, the abolition movement. One thing the abolition movement did was as follows. They said, practices and people who you don't feel like you have a real tie to, you don't feel like you have a kin to, who you English men and women don't see, but on whose labor you depend and from whom you benefit. You are part of them. They are implicated in your fate and vice versa. That the sphere of moral responsibility can actually be understood to be larger and more capacious than the realm of an individual family or region or city or state. It can be seen to encompass all of humanity. We are all implicated in practices even that we do not see. And the kind of aim to establish this shared humanity and tie to each other was such an important theme of the abolition movement. And I think to this day, that might be a strategy we might learn from that movement. In other words, it is slavery in the 19th century was so visible, right? It became so visible. Today, it operates on the margins of human society and is to many of us invisible. But to make it visible and to realize, make visible the principle on which our commitment to freedom depends, which is the principle of our shared humanity. That might be something that we might learn, from this deep study of the past in order to move forward together and to continue that long, unending fight against slavery.
Understood. Thanks, John. Thank you for this conversation and for authoring this fantastic book, The Intellectual Origins of American Slavery. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Praveen, for your time. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.